On the morning of July 9, 1960, the Niagara River shimmered under the summer sun, its deceptively calm surface masking a force of nature that had claimed countless lives before. For 7-year-old Roger Woodward, this day began like an adventure, one of those golden afternoons that live forever in a child's imagination. He was spending time with his older sister, Deanne, 17 years old, who was protective and proud of her little brother, and with James "Jim" Honeycutt, a family friend who had offered to take them on a boat ride. To Roger, the idea of being out on the water felt thrilling, almost magical. The wooden docks, the gentle rocking of the boat, the hum of the small outboard motor. It was the perfect setting for a memory, not a nightmare. Documentaries about this event often begin by reminding viewers of how ordinary it all seemed. The day was warm, the skies clear, and nothing about the scene suggested danger. One narrator described it as a child's summer dream, the kind of day that promises ice cream cones, laughter, and innocence. That was exactly the spirit in which the three of them set off. Roger, wearing a simple orange life preserver, sat in the boat with excitement. Deanne adjusted her skirt in the warm breeze and smiled at her little brother's joy. Honeycutt, who was older and experienced with boats, seemed confident enough to navigate the river's currents. But the Niagara River, as those documentaries often emphasize, is not like any ordinary body of water. Fed by the mighty Great Lakes, its currents are powerful, invisible engines pulling with relentless force toward the edge of the falls. At the surface, in certain areas, the water seems calm, almost inviting. But beneath lies a world of violent undertows and swirling turbulence. Local warnings have always been clear. Even experienced boaters must treat the river with utmost respect. On that day, however, these warnings were distant background noise to a child eager for adventure. As they moved further from shore, the landscape around them painted a postcard-perfect image. The mist from Niagara Falls rose like a ghostly curtain in the distance, catching the light of the sun and creating faint rainbows that shimmered across the sky. For Roger, this was nature's theater, a dazzling show. He leaned over the side of the boat, his small hands dipping into the cool water. He could not know, nor could his sister, that those gentle ripples carried them closer and closer to an unstoppable force. In interviews years later, Deanne would recall the innocence of that moment. "Roger was just a little boy," she said, her voice breaking. "He was laughing. None of us thought, not for a second, what was about to happen." That contrast, the laughter of a child against the looming danger of Niagara, would later become the emotional heartbeat of every retelling of the story. The motorboat itself was small, designed for casual rides, not for battling strong currents. Honeycutt, who was steering, appeared calm, chatting with the children and pointing out sights along the riverbank. Yet the current was stronger than he realized. Every minute, the boat was drifting farther downstream, closer to the point where the river narrows and accelerates into a violent rush toward the falls. Documentary footage often shows aerial shots of the river at this point, wide, glittering, deceptively smooth, and then zooms in toward the rapids, where the water transforms into chaos. The narrator's voice typically grows heavier here, describing how countless others had underestimated this very stretch of river. That is exactly what was unfolding for Roger, Deanne, and Honeycutt. They had unknowingly entered a stretch of water from which escape would soon be impossible. Still, in those first moments, none of them sensed disaster. Roger's eyes sparkled with joy, and his laughter carried across the water. Deanne watched him, probably feeling a mix of amusement and sisterly concern, reminding him to sit back, to be careful. Honeycutt, for his part, was likely enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing this experience with the two young passengers. The tranquility of that boat ride would be seared into memory precisely because it stood in such cruel contrast to what followed. And then, the first subtle signs. The motor sputtered. Honeycutt frowned, tugged at the starter cord, and adjusted the throttle. At first, it was nothing unusual. Engines stall, especially small outboards, but as he worked the controls, the boat failed to respond. The current tugged at them, slowly but insistently, like an invisible hand guiding them toward danger. In that instant, a line was crossed. This was no longer a carefree boat ride. It was the beginning of a struggle against forces far beyond their control. In documentaries, this moment is dramatized with ominous music, the camera panning over the growing mist ahead. The thunder of the falls, barely audible at first, but rising steadily in the background. It was the sound, Deanne later said. That roar of the water, getting louder and louder. That's when I realized we were in trouble. For Roger, though, it was still an adventure. He did not yet understand what the roar meant. At 7 years old, the concept of mortal danger was distant, abstract. He may have even thought it exciting, the boat swaying more wildly, his sister's voice rising with urgency. To him, the world was still safe, the adults still in control. But the Niagara River does not bend to human expectations, and soon, even Roger would feel the terrifying truth of its power. What began as a summer outing, filled with light and laughter, was now sliding quietly and inevitably toward one of the most unforgettable survival stories ever recorded at Niagara Falls. The first sputter of the motor seemed harmless, almost routine, the kind of hiccup every small engine suffers once in a while. But on the Niagara River, where the current is unforgiving and margins for error are razor thin, even a brief malfunction can spiral into catastrophe. James Honeycutt pulled at the starter cord again, his face tightening as the engine coughed, sputtered, and then fell silent. The boat drifted, pulled quietly but persistently toward the downstream current. The surface of the river was still deceptively calm, as if nothing had changed, but beneath, the water was seething with invisible strength. Deanne noticed it first. 17 years old, she was old enough to recognize that something was wrong. The shore was slipping farther away, the boat no longer responding to Honeycutt's efforts. Panic began to flicker in her chest, though she tried to stay composed for her little brother's sake. Roger, still young enough to see adventure in uncertainty, laughed nervously, perhaps sensing the shift in tone, but not fully understanding it. In his world, adults were supposed to fix things. If the engine stopped, surely Honeycutt could start it again. But Honeycutt knew the stakes. He was wrestling with the controls, pulling furiously, muttering under his breath as sweat beaded on his forehead. Each failed attempt grew heavier, the silence between the coughs of the engine filled by something else. A distant thunder, faint at first, then slowly, steadily louder. It was the sound that defined Niagara Falls, the constant roar of millions of gallons of water crashing over the precipice every second. That sound had always been background noise in the distance. Now it was creeping into the foreground, ominous, inescapable. In one documentary about Roger's story, a narrator captures this moment with chilling precision. The current does not negotiate, it does not wait. When the motor failed, their fate was sealed. The river had taken control. That truth was dawning on Deanne and Honeycutt in real time. Honeycutt's face betrayed the realization that they were no longer guiding the boat. The boat was being guided by something far larger, something merciless. The current grew stronger, the boat beginning to sway and shudder as it entered a faster stretch of water. Roger felt the difference now. The once gentle rocking became unpredictable, sharp. He clutched the sides, his small hands tightening around the wood. The excitement he felt earlier dimmed, replaced by a new sensation, fear, though he could not have put it into words. Deanne shouted at Honeycutt, her voice high and urgent, but he barely responded, his focus locked on the engine and the river ahead. The boat was sliding toward the first signs of rapids, where the river's calm surface shattered into whitecaps and swirling eddies. Here, the water no longer pretended to be friendly. It tossed the boat as if it were a toy, reminding them that the calm of earlier had been an illusion. Local historians often describe this section of the Niagara River as the point of no return. Once a vessel drifts beyond a certain marker, the chances of reaching safety shrink to almost nothing. The current accelerates with terrifying force, narrowing into a funnel that feeds directly toward the edge of Horseshoe Falls. For generations, boaters and swimmers had been warned, never underestimate this stretch of river. On that day, Honeycutt, Deanne, and Roger had crossed into that forbidden zone without even realizing it. The scene in documentaries often cuts here to aerial shots. The boat, small and fragile, drifting closer to the rapids, dwarfed by the immensity of the river. The roar grows louder, not just as a sound, but as a presence, vibrating in the chest, echoing through the air. Even viewers decades later can feel the inevitability pressing down. They are being carried toward a place from which no one escapes. Deanne's instinct for survival kicked in. She began shouting for help, her voice carrying faintly across the water. But the river was wide, and the mist rising from the falls clouded the view. People on shore would later recall hearing screams, but not realizing in those first moments what was happening. Honeycutt's desperation grew. He tried paddling, though the effort was laughable against such force. The boat responded only to the river, jerking forward, spinning slightly, then lunging toward the froth of the rapids. Roger, frightened now, clung tightly to his sister. He began crying, asking what was happening, his small voice breaking against the roar. Deanne wrapped her arm around him, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. She was terrified, but she knew her brother needed her calm more than her panic. Honeycutt shouted at them to hold on, his own voice ragged with fear. The boat entered the rapids. Everything became chaos, waves slamming against the sides, spray drenching their faces, the boat spinning violently. The horizon tilted and blurred, the sound of the falls now a deafening roar that consumed everything else. This was no longer a summer outing. It was a struggle for survival, and deep inside, each of them must have known the odds. The river had made its decision, one documentary narrator says. They were passengers now, not pilots, and the only destination was the edge of Niagara Falls. For Roger, the boy who had started the day laughing at the thrill of the ride, the adventure had turned into terror. The river that had seemed like a playground was now a predator, pulling him, his sister and Honeycutt closer and closer to the abyss. The rapids seized the boat with merciless strength, tossing it from side to side like driftwood. The calm water of earlier was gone, replaced by white froth, crashing waves and violent surges that made it impossible to hold steady. Every second brought them closer to the precipice of Niagara Falls. For Deanne, the roar ahead was no longer a distant sound, but a living, breathing force surrounding them, drowning out even her own screams. She gripped her brother Roger with one arm and the side of the capsizing boat with the other, her knuckles white, her heart pounding with terror. Honeycutt's efforts had become frantic. He clung to the boat's controls, then to the oars, then to anything that might give him leverage. But the current mocked every movement, dragging the boat relentlessly forward. To fight Niagara was like trying to stop a storm with bare hands. It was futile. In one documentary, a survivor of another near drowning at Niagara described the moment perfectly. "You don't swim the river swims you." That was the grim reality closing in on them now. The boat slammed hard against a hidden rock. The impact jolted Roger, nearly throwing him into the water. Deanne screamed and pulled him close, but the collision had doomed them. The boat spun sideways, then tipped violently. In a single shattering moment, it capsized, hurling its passengers into the raging current. For a boy of 7, the chaos must have been unimaginable. Roger plunged into the icy water, the shock stealing his breath, his body tossed like a ragdoll. The bright orange preserver he wore, an afterthought, just a safety precaution when they set out, suddenly became the only thing between him and certain death. The foam vest kept him afloat, though every wave forced him under, every swirl dragged him toward the abyss. Deanne was flung toward a jagged cluster of rocks near the river's edge. Desperation lent her strength. She clawed at the slick surface, her fingers tearing against the stone, until she found a grip. She pulled herself upward, choking on river spray, coughing, screaming her brother's name. She could see Roger swept farther into the current, his small arms flailing. And she could see Honeycutt struggling, fighting, and then disappearing beneath the churning water. From the shoreline, witnesses were beginning to gather. They had heard the cries, seen the boat overturn, and now watched helplessly as the river claimed its victims. Some pointed to Deanne clinging to the rocks, shouting for help. Others turned their horrified eyes toward the small boy drifting toward the mist-shrouded edge. One man later told reporters, "You could see him. You could see the boy being carried, and you knew what was coming, and there wasn't a thing you could do." For Roger, the world had collapsed into confusion. He was coughing, gasping, eyes stinging from spray. He saw flashes of sky, then water, then the looming mist ahead. The roar was deafening, a sound so immense that it seemed to come from everywhere at once. At 7 years old, he may not have understood the mechanics of Niagara Falls, but instinct told him the truth. Something immense and final lay ahead. Deanne, clinging to the rocks, was screaming his name over and over. "Roger! Roger!" Her voice was swallowed by the roar. She would later recall that moment as the most helpless of her life. She had saved herself, but she could not reach her brother. No one could. Honeycutt, meanwhile, was gone. He had no life preserver, no chance against the raging water. His body was swallowed by the river, a tragic casualty that underscored the hopelessness of their situation. He had tried to save the children, but now he was a victim himself. The seconds ticked away, each one carrying Roger closer to the brink. In documentaries, this moment is often drawn out with slow-motion visuals. Aerial footage of the river narrowing, the mist rising in thick plumes, and the narrator's voice heavy with inevitability. Once you enter the current of Niagara, there is no turning back. The falls do not forgive. They do not let go. Roger's small body, bright against the dark water, drifted straight into the channel, feeding the Horseshoe Falls. The mist ahead grew thicker, swallowing the horizon. For those watching from shore, it was agonizing. Some screamed for help, others prayed aloud, and some simply froze, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. At 7 years old, Roger was about to do what no one had ever done and lived to tell. Go over the most powerful waterfall in North America. The curtain of water ahead was massive, an unbroken wall plunging 188 feet into a cauldron of swirling foam and rock. Experts would later say the survival odds were 0. No child, no adult, no one could possibly endure that fall and live. And yet, the river carried him forward, indifferent, unstoppable. Roger had seconds left before the edge. The mist consumed him, the roar reached its peak, and the unimaginable became inevitable. He was going over Niagara Falls. The edge of the Horseshoe Falls is not a place where human life is meant to pass. It is the threshold between two worlds, the relative calm of the river above and the violent chaos below, where water and gravity collide with a force few can imagine. On July 9th, 1960, Roger Woodward, just 7 years old, crossed that threshold. Swept helplessly by the current, he was carried over the brink of Niagara Falls. The plunge is 188 feet, a drop so immense that water does not simply fall. It hurls itself into the void, pounding into the rocks below with a thunderous crash. More than 600,000 gallons of water per second surge over the Horseshoe Falls, each gallon striking with the weight of a hammer. To fall through that torrent is to enter a world of sound and violence, where the air itself becomes water, and the line between life and death blurs in an instant. For Roger, the moment was pure chaos. Witnesses later described seeing his small body vanish into the mist, his orange preserver the last flash of color before he disappeared. No scream could be heard over the roar, no plea for help could pierce the wall of sound. He was gone, swallowed by one of the most dangerous natural wonders on Earth. Documentary filmmakers often pause here, letting the weight of the moment sink in. They cut to slow, almost reverent shots of the falls themselves, the water curling over the edge in majestic arcs, the mist billowing upward like smoke from a great fire. A narrator's voice, low and deliberate, explains the brutal reality. No human body can withstand such a fall. The velocity, the pressure, the sheer force, it is a death sentence. And yet, this would not be the end of Roger's story. The drop was instantaneous but felt eternal. Imagine the sensation, the stomach lurching upward, the body weightless and yet crushed at the same time, the roar of water louder than thunder, the blinding spray stinging the eyes, filling the lungs. For a child, there would have been no comprehension, only raw fear and instinct. The bright life preserver clung to his small frame as he plunged into the abyss. When he hit the pool below, the violence was unimaginable. The water was not simply liquid. It was a pulverizing storm of foam, rock, and crushing currents. The impact should have broken bones, torn flesh, ended everything. And yet, when Roger struck the pool, the life vest kept him buoyant, just enough to prevent him from sinking to the bottom. Instead, he was caught in the swirling turbulence, tossed and spun like a leaf in a hurricane. Above, onlookers gasped. Some cried out in horror, others turned away, unable to watch what they were certain was a child's final moments. "We thought it was over," one witness recalled in a later interview. "No one comes out of that alive. No one. But fate, or something beyond human understanding, had other plans." Against all odds, Roger surfaced, battered, bruised, choking on water but alive. His small body bobbed among the waves, the orange preserver holding him aloft. It was a sight so improbable that those who saw it were struck silent, unsure if they could trust their own eyes. Documentaries often underscore this point by reminding viewers that Roger was the first known person to survive a plunge over Horseshoe Falls without protective equipment. Stuntmen had gone over before, sealed in barrels or harnessed in specially designed contraptions, and even then many had not survived. But Roger, a child with nothing but a foam preserver, had done what no one thought possible. The seconds after the fall were as perilous as the plunge itself. The water below the falls is a maelstrom of currents, undertows, and hidden whirlpools. Survivors often describe it as being tossed in every direction at once. For Roger, each wave threatened to drag him under, each swirl to trap him beneath. His small hands clawed at the surface, his chest heaved with desperation, but somehow, impossibly, he remained afloat. For a boy who had started his day with laughter on a boat ride, the transformation was almost biblical. He had entered the jaws of Niagara itself and emerged alive. One documentary narrator captured it with awe. It was as if the falls had decided to spare him, a miracle in the purest sense of the word. In those moments, Roger did not know he had made history. He only knew that he was alive and that he was terrified, surrounded by endless water, mist, and noise. The falls had tested him with their full fury, and he had survived the abyss. But survival in the water did not mean rescue. Alone in the turbulent pool, Roger faced another fight, to be found, to be pulled from the grip of Niagara before it claimed him after all. That fight would come next, when the crew of a boat named Maid of the Mist spotted the impossible, a small boy, alive where no one should be. Below the mighty Horseshoe Falls, where survival was deemed impossible, Roger Woodward floated in the churning chaos. His small body bobbed up and down in the foam, battered by waves, his orange life preserver barely keeping him above the surface. He coughed, gasped, and flailed, the roar of Niagara still deafening all around him. He had survived the abyss, but he was still far from safe. The turbulent waters at the base of the falls had claimed countless lives, even after the plunge itself. The boy was alive, but the river was not finished with him yet. It was at this critical moment that fate placed him in the path of the Maid of the Mist. The sightseeing vessel, already legendary in Niagara's history, was on one of its regular tours that afternoon. Passengers aboard were marveling at the thunderous curtain of water when someone spotted an extraordinary sight, a small boy, adrift among the waves, alone. At first, some thought it must be debris, perhaps a bright piece of fabric tossed into the river. But then, As the boat edged closer, the unmistakable shape of a child came into view. Gasps rippled across the deck. The captain of the vessel, Clifford Keach, was faced with a split-second decision. The waters near the falls were treacherous, filled with unpredictable surges and whirlpool. Maneuvering a boat that size near a struggling child was incredibly dangerous. Yet Keach did not hesitate. He ordered the crew to bring the Maid of the Mist closer. The tourists aboard held their breath as the great vessel fought the currents, edging toward the boy who should not have been alive. One of the deckhands later described the scene with awe. He was just there, this little boy in the water, like the river had delivered him to us. He looked so small against the power of it all. The crew scrambled into action, grabbing ropes and life rings. As the boat drew near, Roger's arms flailed weakly as though reaching for salvation. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. Every second mattered. One wrong wave could drag him under forever. The crew shouted to him, though it is doubtful he heard anything over the roar. They tossed ropes into the water, maneuvering carefully so as not to crush him against the hull. In that moment, the strength of men and the precision of the crew became the final line between life and death. Passengers watched with tears in their eyes, some crying out prayers, others covering their mouths in disbelief. Finally, one crewman leaned dangerously over the side, stretching out his arm. Roger, exhausted and on the verge of slipping under, managed to reach. Their hands connected, small fingers clinging desperately to the rough grip of salvation. With one heave, the crew pulled him aboard. The deck erupted in cries of relief and disbelief. A boy had gone over Niagara Falls, and he was alive, standing now on the deck of the Maid of the Mist. Documentaries often linger on this image, the tiny, drenched figure, trembling, coughing, wrapped quickly in blankets by shocked tourists and crew. He didn't even cry right away, one witness recalled. He just looked around, wide-eyed, like he couldn't believe it either. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone on board. People hugged strangers, some wept openly, and many stared back toward the falls with a mix of awe and fear. The falls, a symbol of untamed nature, had taken so many lives over centuries, but on this day it had spared a child. The Maid of the Mist had become not just a sightseeing boat, but a vessel of rescue, forever tied to one of the most miraculous survival stories in modern history. Once safely aboard, Roger was checked quickly for injuries. Aside from cuts, bruises, and the shock of the ordeal, he was astonishingly unharmed. Doctors later marveled that a fall of that magnitude had not left him broken. Some said it was the life preserver, some credited sheer luck, and others spoke of divine intervention. Whatever the explanation, Roger's rescue became the turning point in the story, the moment when tragedy transformed into miracle. On shore, news of the survival spread like wildfire. Journalists rushed to capture the details. Photographers snapped images of the boy bundled in blankets, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead, his small face pale but alive. Headlines around the world carried the impossible news: "Boy survives Niagara Falls plunge." In the years that followed, those who had been aboard the Maid of the Mist never forgot what they had witnessed. It was like watching the impossible happen, one passenger said decades later in an interview. "We thought we were just there to see the falls, but that day we saw something none of us will ever see again. A child walked back from the edge of death." Roger himself would grow older with the knowledge that he had been given a second chance, his life spared in a way few could comprehend. But in that moment, on the deck of the boat, surrounded by strangers who had become rescuers, he was simply a boy who had been saved. And for everyone who witnessed it, it felt like standing in the presence of a miracle. The raging waters at the base of Horseshoe Falls were a place no one was ever meant to survive. They churned violently, foaming white, colliding in unpredictable whirlpools that had swallowed countless lives before. For most who went over Niagara, this was the end. Yet on July 9, 1960, in that chaos of water and noise, a small figure in a life jacket was fighting for breath. disoriented and battered, but somehow still alive. Roger Woodward, just 7 years old, had just defied one of the greatest odds known to man. But survival was only half the miracle. Now came the second, rescue. Without it, the river could still claim him. The Maid of the Mist was navigating the basin that day, carrying a load of stunned tourists who had come to experience the spray and thunder of the falls. Captain Clifford Keach and his crew had made this voyage countless times before. They knew the dangers intimately, the unpredictable swells, the dangerous currents that could push a vessel off course, and the sheer impossibility of maneuvering too close to the boiling center beneath the falls. And yet, what they saw that day was not a sight for entertainment. It was a boy, flailing, vanishing, then resurfacing in the white froth, caught between life and death. Eyewitnesses later recalled the audible gasp that moved through the passengers as they spotted Roger. Some screamed, others pointed desperately, urging the crew to act. Accounts from documentaries such as Niagara Miracles, Myths and Magic highlight the precision and bravery required in those moments. The Maid of the Mist was no small vessel. It was a large boat, difficult to maneuver in such turbulent water. One wrong move, and not only would Roger be lost, but the boat itself could be pushed into a perilous position. The crew knew this, but hesitation was not an option. As the captain steered closer, crew members prepared themselves for the rescue, ropes in hand, eyes locked on the tiny figure drifting amidst waves taller than him. The boy, exhausted, had little strength left. His arms barely moved, his body rolled with the current, and his head bobbed under again and again. Time was running out. The drama unfolded in a terrifying dance of water and steel. Passengers held their breath, many whispering prayers as they watched. Later, some would recount that it felt as though the entire boat willed Roger to hold on just a little longer. The crew leaned over the edge, calling out, though their voices were drowned in the roar of the falls. Roger would later say that he had no memory of the words, no sense of direction, only the overwhelming sound and the feeling of being dragged into darkness. But fate aligned in that moment. A hand reached, a rope swung, and finally, miraculously, Roger was pulled toward the vessel's side. The image of the soaked, terrified, and trembling boy being lifted from the water is one that stayed with witnesses forever. Documentaries often replay this moment with dramatized footage, underscoring the impossible nature of his survival. One crew member later reflected that they didn't just save a boy that day, they saved a story that would echo through history. As Roger lay on the deck, coughing and gasping for air, the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a rescue, this was a defiance of every rule that nature had written about Niagara Falls. The emotional release on board the Maid of the Mist was overwhelming. Passengers erupted in tears and applause, hugging strangers, some collapsing into prayer. They knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, an intersection of tragedy and miracle. And for the crew, the act of pulling Roger from those waters was more than duty. It was an affirmation of courage in the face of nature's unforgiving power. Later reports would note that without the Maid of the Mist, without that crew being there in that precise moment, Roger's miraculous fall would have ended not in survival, but in another tragic statistic of Niagara's deadly waters. As news spread in the hours and days after, the image of the Maid of the Mist crew became entwined with Roger's story. They were no longer just boat operators guiding tourists into the mist. They had become saviors, witnesses to the impossible, and key players in a narrative that blended human bravery with divine mystery. To this day, their actions are remembered not just as an act of seamanship, but as one of compassion, the willingness to risk everything to save a child against forces far greater than themselves. The rescue marked the turning point in the saga. Until then, it was a story of tragedy, with the death of James Honeycutt and the horror of 2 children swept toward doom. But with Roger's survival, it became something else. A story of hope, resilience, and the reminder that even in the jaws of nature's greatest dangers, humanity can still reach out and pull life back from the brink. Roger Woodward's survival over Niagara Falls did more than shock the world. It became a story that would ripple through generations, inspiring awe, fear, and reflection on the sheer unpredictability of nature. In the immediate aftermath, the world struggled to comprehend how a 7-year-old boy could survive what countless adults and stuntmen had failed to endure. Newspapers around the globe splashed headlines proclaiming a miracle. Journalists flocked to the hospital where Roger was being treated, eager to capture every detail of his near-death experience. But as incredible as the headlines were, the true legacy of Roger's survival lay in the human response, the wonder, the inspiration, and the cautionary tales that followed. In documentaries and interviews decades later, scholars and historians emphasize that Roger's story transcended the simple narrative of survival. It became a lens through which people explored the power and danger of Niagara Falls. Experts repeatedly referenced the statistical improbability of his survival, noting that falls over Horseshoe Falls had always been fatal without protective devices or barrels. Roger Woodward was a child in the purest sense, one narrator explains in a film chronicling the event. A child facing forces that dwarf human understanding and living to tell the tale. That is the legacy of courage, chance, and perhaps something more. Beyond the numbers, the story profoundly impacted those who witnessed it. Passengers aboard the Maid of the Mist described feeling that they had glimpsed the miraculous. Visitors who later saw photographs of the soaked, trembling boy felt a mixture of relief, disbelief, and humility in the face of nature. Roger became not just a survivor, but a symbol, a living reminder that life can defy the odds. His story has been recounted countless times in documentaries, books, and educational programs about Niagara, often framed as a cautionary tale about the river's power, but also as an emblem of hope and resilience. Over time, Roger's survival prompted a cultural reflection on the balance between human daring and nature's unpredictability. Niagara Falls, already a site of fascination and tourism, became a symbol of both awe and respect. Guides began emphasizing the river's danger, safety protocols were reinforced, and visitors were reminded of the fragile boundary between wonder and risk. Roger's story served as a living illustration. The river demands respect, yet it also inspires reverence for the resilience of life. Roger himself has carried this legacy throughout his life. While the public initially focused on the miraculous nature of the event, Roger's later reflections highlight a more personal understanding that he was given a second chance, one that few people ever receive. In interviews, he has described feeling a profound sense of responsibility to live fully, to honor the life that had been preserved by circumstance, skill, and the courage of strangers. This perspective transforms the narrative from one of mere survival to one of purpose. He became a silent ambassador of resilience, showing that even those who face unimaginable danger can emerge with strength and perspective. The story of Roger Woodward has also permeated the tourism and media narratives surrounding Niagara Falls. Every year, visitors learn about his survival in visitor centers and historical displays. Filmmakers and educators often use his story to illustrate both the beauty and the peril of the falls. His survival is recounted not as an isolated miracle, but as a human connection to one of nature's most formidable forces. People continue to be inspired, moved, and sometimes humbled by the idea that one child, alone in the fury of the river, could survive what seems impossible. Finally, the legacy of Roger's survival extends into human imagination. Documentaries often highlight the combination of chance, courage, and human intervention, the small life preserver, the timing of the Maid of the Mist, the skill of the crew, as elements that remind viewers that life is a fragile, fleeting, and miraculous gift. His story continues to be cited in discussions of survival psychology, human resilience, and the extraordinary moments where ordinary life intersects with extraordinary circumstances. Decades after that fateful day, Roger's survival remains one of the most astonishing tales in Niagara Falls' long history. It is a story retold with reverence, awe, and deep respect for both the river and the human spirit. The legacy of survival is not merely in the headlines, but in the enduring message that even when faced with forces beyond comprehension, life can prevail, and human courage and compassion can create miracles in the most unlikely places. Roger Woodward did not just survive the falls, he carried forward a narrative that continues to teach, inspire, and astonish the world. If Roger's incredible story left you in awe, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life survival tales. Share this video with friends who love stories that defy the odds, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next amazing story. Comment below. What would you do if you were in Roger's shoes? Your thoughts might inspire our next episode. Dive deeper into the world of miracles and human resilience right here, and join our community that celebrates the extraordinary in everyday life.